Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Dave, and this is a Training Bible podcast. It's been a hot minute since we recorded, so I think we're kicking off. I think this is season 5 now, and today I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Phil Batterson. Phil is a coach and an integrative physiologist and the head of physiology at Moxie. Phil, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for having me on. This is fun. We met right because of Full Gas, and before even the first meeting, we started talking, and we were like, we need to get each other on our podcast. So Dave will be coming hopefully on the Critical Oxygen podcast at some time as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that's a great kind of segue. You're also a host of a podcast, Critical Oxygen, in which you talk about, I'm sure we'll get into Moxie a little bit here, but basically infrared technology that kind of measures muscle or oxygen saturation at the muscle. Expand a little bit more. Tell us about yourself and kind of what you do.
Yeah, definitely. So the Critical Oxygen, or just Critical Oxygen in general, is kind of my physiology coaching business. And I felt a need within the endurance community to help bridge the gap between the research that's out there and then actual coaching practices. I felt like the researchers were saying one thing, coaches were saying another. So the whole tagline or mission statement for Critical Oxygen is helping athletes and coaches optimize their physiology to maximize their endurance potential. So with that, we use, the physiological principles, that are taught to you in your general exercise physiology classes, as well as the research that's out there, and then new technology, or just technology in general, that has, started to come up and be available to the masses. So that's kind of my whole shtick. I got my master's degree. Well, so I guess I can start back a little bit further than that. I promise this won't be too long, but I started my journey in junior high. I wrestled for a winter, and then coming off of that winter season, I think it was like 8th grade, went and did track and field, and absolutely crushed it. I don't think my high school or my junior high wasn't anything special, but I set the mile record and the 2-mile record.
Oh, nice.
And that was the first indication that I had any sort of talent in any sport. I wish I had talent in baseball, basketball, football, those sort of things, because that was what I was brought up on. But this first indication that I had some level of talent and endurance kind of sparked the fire to try to get better at it.
Yeah.
Then throughout high school, I ran cross country and track, dabbled in wrestling a little bit. I was 6 foot tall and 135 pounds. So I wasn't much of a wrestler. I was just a string bean out there. Yeah. But it was something that wrestling really taught me a lot about conditioning and getting into shape and other things like that, where during cross country and track, a lot of the times, I had coaches who were I would ask them, why are we doing this sort of workout? And they just would say, because I said so. That never resonated well with me. I like to think I'm kind of a smart guy, so I always want the why behind things.
Right.
Why are we doing this? Why are we doing 20 by 400s? 2 days before the regional race or something like that. Of course, I'm going to ask. This seems a little ridiculous. So that passion, has always kind of been there. And then going into undergrad, I went to the University of Michigan, and I wasn't good enough to be on their cross country team, so I was on the rowing team. And that was kind of my first foray into a coach who actually did, really focused on taking your performance, so something like FTP or something along those lines, and then breaking your training into easier days, medium or moderate days, and then hard days.
Right.
And it was amazing what he was able to do. We had 75 or 100 people, guys on the team, and we were a club team, and we would very regularly beat other varsity teams just because of the way that the coach was able to implement training and pretty much just get the best out of every guy that was on that team. So that was really interesting to me. Did my first degree in mechanical engineering, which is not endurance or exercise physiology. But the love of optimization of machines and optimization of different systems has always been there, and that's where I think this engineering still plays a role in my life. So then I went down, got my first job, corporate, absolutely hated it. Felt like I was just working until I was ready to retire and then die. So really kind of had a come to, I don't want to say come to Jesus moment because I'm not super religious, but a kind of like come to the light moment where it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to spend the next 40 to 50 years of my life doing something that gets me paid but gives me no joy. So I started to think about what gives me joy and what do I want to actually do with my life. So I pivoted to cross country coaching, and I was able to coach a cross country team. In high school, I was just the assistant coach, but the team was really successful. They were the first team out of Georgia to qualify for the Nike national meet.
Oh, nice.
Which was really, really sweet. So I was able to see that coach in that environment again. And, picking up all of these things, like I pick up patterns. I'm like, oh, this coach is actually individualizing this training, even though he has 40 people on the team, and he has kind of a set of rules that he follows in order to get everybody to an optimal place. Then with that, I was like, okay, I'm going to go back. I want to be a coach. But I need to probably do some biology classes because I'd never taken a biology course before. So I went to a junior college and was like taking exercise physiology or just physiology in general, anatomy, general biology classes, those sort of things, getting ready to, apply for a master's degree. And during that time, I reached out to the coach at the junior college, and he was like, well, I was like, hey, do you need an assistant coach? More than happy just to volunteer and do it. And by the way, here are my 5K times right now. I don't know why I put those. I think it was just to show that like I was still in shape.
Yeah.
And he came back and he was like, oh, do you want to, like, you can definitely be my assistant coach, but do you want to be on the team and I can give you a full ride scholarship?
Oh shit.
Yeah. So
Nice.
I was like, yeah, dude, yeah, sign me up. Like, what do I do? So that like assistant coaching position really turned into me being more of like a graduate assistant for him, because at the time I was 24 and the people on the junior college team were like 17, 18, and 19. So I was essentially the babysitter for the kids on the team. And that was a really fun experience again, because this coach was able to recruit a national caliber women's team that actually won the national championship meet that year. And I was essentially the assistant coach. So I've been like the assistant coach for a number of pretty successful, teams at this point. And I'm like, oh, this is sweet. Every time I go and, coach somewhere, like it seems to work out.
Yeah.
Obviously the head coaches are the ones that are doing the job. I can't take credit for that. But at the same time, it was still like, oh, my compass is probably pointing in the right direction.
Right.
So then I got hooked up with a guy who turned out to be my master's advisor, Dr. Robbie Jacobs, while I was participating in a research study on the effects of different drugs on high altitude sickness. So basically what they did is they recruited a bunch of, college age people who could pass the military, like the Army fitness test. And then 2 weeks leading up to going to altitude, because we were at sea level in Michigan, they gave us, some drug that they thought was going to be able to decrease the prevalence of high altitude sickness. And during one of the things we did like a 4-mile ruck hike, started at 10,000 feet and got up to 12,000 feet. And one of the researchers at the top just so happened to turn into my department chair. And I rode down the mountain in the back of the truck with him. And I was just talking about what I'm interested in and all this other stuff. And he was like, oh, I got somebody who I think, you would vibe with really well. So I got hooked up with my master's advisor. He offered me a position, like a research position. And then the school gave me a teaching position. So I went out to University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, which is just south of you. And was out there for 2 years during my master's degree. And that's where I started to really get into like the applied physiology testing. We'd bring people in, we do, a maximal exercise test to exhaustion to get their VO2 max or maximal oxygen consumption. We could determine their zones and we could determine their efficiencies and those sort of things. And my whole master's thesis was on traditional predictors of endurance performance. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, there's a lot of researchers who have published a lot of papers that basically say the combination of an athlete's economy or efficiency, where their second threshold is occurring, and then their VO2 max is together really, really capable of predicting someone's ability to do endurance performance.
So when you say second threshold, that would be akin to like what we call FTP or critical power.
Yep. FTP, critical power, maximal lactate, steady state, ventilatory threshold 2, NIRS breakpoint 2, lactate at 4 millimole. Like there's tons and tons and tons of different, terminology for it. But yes, FTP would be, the most functional. It's in the name, the most, kind of like functional threshold, second threshold.
Yeah.
So that combination. And then our wrinkle was that we use near-infrared spectroscopy. We were using two different devices, the Moxie, which was a affordable consumer grade device, and then a quote unquote lab grade gold standard device. I put it in quotes because
quotes,
it's like, it was just a really, really expensive piece of equipment that shined light into your muscle. And gave us the same results as the Moxie, essentially. But what we found is that using NIRS, we were actually able to determine your muscle's ability to uptake and utilize oxygen, and that was the single best predictor of endurance performance. So better than the combination of VO2 max, FTP, and economy.
Really?
Alone, muscle oxygen capacity. So your ability to basically get oxygen to the capillaries, have those capillaries diffuse that oxygen to the mitochondria, and have the mitochondria use that oxygen, single best predictor of endurance performance.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
That's
you're
something
like,
I want to come back to.
I can see your mind kind of getting blown. You're like, wait a minute.
Yeah, exactly. And I definitely want to come back to that, because that's not what we set out to discuss today, but we're definitely going to come back to that.
Yes. Yeah, we certainly can. So during that, and especially that last portion where we were kind of discovering that, maybe there's something to do. I call it the capillary myoglobin mitochondrial axis, or the oxidative axis. And that subunit seems to be the most important for endurance performance. So that really kind of got me interested in more of like the molecular side of exercise physiology. So with that, I was like, ooh, this would be really cool if I could go study this, for a PhD. So my advisor had some connections with the guys who ended up being my PhD advisors over at Oregon State University. And they had an opening. They had 2 openings for PhD students. So I joined their lab and didn't further that area of research. I kind of stopped being in the applied endurance performance realm and was more in the how do our skeletal muscle mitochondria adapt to things like exercise and dietary interventions in the context of sedentary behavior, high fat diet, overfeeding in mice, and other things like that. So more the disease side of things.
Okay.
And if you've ever worked with either mice or people who don't want to exercise, it's really, really tough to get people to exercise, or mice to even exercise if they don't want to do it. So during that time, I kind of learned and started to appreciate more and more the athlete side of things, the endurance development side of things. So I was like, okay, well, do my PhD in this, and then pretty much as soon as I'm done with that, I want to pivot back out to where the compass was pointing initially, which is like the coaching side of things, the education side of things, and all of that. And that's where I'm at now. So I told everybody this wasn't going to take a long time, and then it did. But that's my background, and that's why I'm kind of fueled towards getting on podcasts like this, talking to you about this, talking to just like the best coaches in the world, how they use the research, and talking to the researchers as well, and trying to get both sides to communicate a little bit better, because that is what I think is going to lead us to, even furthering our athletes' athletic potential.
Yeah. And I certainly appreciate that. And like you and I talked about offline, I think one of the first times we talked, one of the reasons I coach and have a podcast is because there's so much bullshit out there. There's so much noise. Every
Yeah.
day there's, some new product somebody's trying to push on you, or some new supplement or something like that. And so I feel like my job as a coach is to help act as a filter, simplify things, and tell people like what actually works. And you mentioned it several times before we started recording. It's like in my experience, I just realized that I've been coaching 13 years now. In my experience, consistency is like the biggest thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so like before we start looking at all these other things, it's like, are you consistent? Like how often are you working out? How frequently? How consistently?
Yeah.
And then you said specificity and progression are kind of the next two there. And
Yeah.
so I appreciate that you do that, because it's like, for me, a lot of times it's like, it's hard to read papers, or like to read all the papers. And so I appreciate people like you and Oscar Eukendrup and Alex Hutchinson, who can take the science and make it easier for us to understand and really like apply it in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I asked you to come on is because I go down this rabbit hole every winter, where I start like doing research into like better ways to test, or more accurate ways to determine whether we're calling it FTP or critical power or maximal lactate steady state. And I always like just kind of like go in circles and always come up with the same kind of conclusions every winter. But I think it's cool to have you on and really discuss like, what do these things mean? Why does it matter?
Mm-hmm.
And what are some of the, I don't know if pitfalls the right words, but like, what are some of the flaws in some of these tests that we do? And I think the most popular test is, people like to do a 20-minute maximal power test, multiply it times 95%, and that becomes their FTP. So let's start just by like, we all talk about zones. Sometimes there's like a 5-zone model. Sometimes there's a 7-zone model, 3-zone model. So when we talk about zones, when we're actually talking about the body and what's actually measurable, what we can see, how many actual zones are there?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this question because, and we'll get into, why, like the say 5-zone model, 7-zone model and stuff exists, but any research paper, or potentially like I would say the majority of research papers that you read, if they're looking at training intensity distributions or zoning, there's really only 3 zones that exist. And I would say that maybe there's a fourth one. So stay tuned. But no, so what we're trying to do is like by determining zones, we're trying to delineate between different physiological states in the body. So for example, if you have a 3-zone model, right, you have your kind of your low to moderate intensity exercise, you have your middle of the road intensity exercise, more akin to like, like sweet spot or threshold training, and then you have your high intensity exercise. The break points, or the transition points that actually tell us where different zones are occurring, are your first threshold. So that first threshold is going to be, and I laugh because there's 20 different definitions again, but it's, if you go in ventilatory threshold 1, people have tried to identify it with heart rate variability. People have used NIRS like Moxie monitor to determine the first transition, or the first break point in near infrared spectroscopy, the first break point, or the first rise in blood lactate above baseline, or 2 millimole of lactate, or the first 1 millimolar rise in lactate. So there's tons and tons of definitions, but the first threshold is that first shift, essentially from where your cells can maintain homeostasis really, really well, to where, our cells may not, may be shifting away from, fat max is also another another threshold, first threshold. Yeah. So essentially what we're trying to do, though, is we're trying to detect the point where our bodies are recruiting more type 2 fibers compared to type 1 fibers, or where we're shifting from oxidizing the majority of fat to more carbohydrates. So that's the first threshold. And it's pretty challenging to actually measure just because the changes or the differences that we're actually looking at are very, very small. So those shifts are pretty challenging to actually measure. So first threshold is essentially, if we're just thinking about it, that transition from all day riding pace to something that is going to maybe not be an all day thing anymore.
So with that, like I've heard some people, and I kind of use it too, is like using breathing as an indication there too. And
Mm.
so like using like talking to an athlete and telling them like conversational pace. Like once you're
Mhm.
getting to a point where conversation is becoming difficult, you're probably past that threshold. Do you
Mhm.
think that's fairly accurate, or like?
I think it gets us, and and a lot of this, a lot of my answers to these questions are probably going to be like, well, it depends,
Yeah,
or
totally.
does it get us 90 to 95% of the way there? And I think using the talk test gets us 90 to 95% of the way there. I think there's, with any rule, there's exceptions to it, because there's probably people who can talk until they're they're at VO2 max, and there's other people who, because their breathing mechanics are different and maybe not as coordinated, are going to have a lot tougher time using that as like a true accurate gauge. But it's better than nothing. If you're just going out and you're kind of just being like, oh, I'm going to go run or ride at something that at something that feels generally easy to me, I think using some sort of gauge, talk test, even rating of perceived exertion, can be good. And I think I've seen people use like 2.5 to 3.5 as like that RPE. So it's like, it's pretty low.
Yeah, so let me ask you that, and like I warned you that we're not going to get through all our bullet points.
Yeah, that's fine.
Um, so that's something that's really interesting to me, and I think I was talking to an athlete about this yesterday. It's like I think there's always this mentality that if a little of something is good, then more is better, right? And
Uh-huh.
so like when we're riding, like if we want to call it zone two pace or endurance pace, like if it feels easy, it can't be right. So
Right.
it's like everybody wants to like ride right at the top of it, and it's like
Right.
my kind of advice a lot of times is like it should feel the first 2 to 3 hours it should feel pretty easy, but the last
Mm-hmm.
2 to 3 hours it's going to start to that same wattage or effort's going to take a little bit more effort, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
when we're talking about this huge range, so like if we're talking about the 7 zone model, it's they're talking about like from 56% to 75% FTP would be like your
Mm-hmm.
zone two. So the great big range, right? Is there any benefit? Like, are you getting any more benefit being right at the top than being in the middle or a little bit lower than that?
I think you're getting marginal benefits, and it's something I struggle with all the time. So for those athletes that are out there, I totally feel you. If something feels too easy, I think, from a psychological perspective, especially someone who's trying to get a coach and, really kind of on like the, I'm going to train optimally in order to, get the most adaptations. I think we as type A individuals have a tendency to push things. We're like, okay, well, exactly like you said, if a little bit is good, then riding at right at that top of that zone is probably the best. And I mean, you hear it on popular podcasts and other things like that, where it's like, oh, well, if you're not at that, actual, I'm going to put quotes again, threshold, because it's a transition area. It's not a point.
Oh, I like
Um,
that. I like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a threshold area or a transition area, not a point, because um I mean, error in measurement and other things like that. But whether you're getting exactly at that, point that we think of it being, or you're, again, are you 95% of the way there? Most likely. You're, how much, you have to think about how much above resting are you compared to, like, in proximity to that first, transition area. I tell people this all the time, especially in running, is like, if I'm sitting here at my desk, maybe like 55 to 70 beats per minute is my heart rate. But if I'm walking actually uphill and doing, walking kind of fast, I can get my heart rate up to like 110,
Yeah.
115. So you can't tell me that is a stress on your body. So, and what your body is trying to do is it tries to adapt to stresses that are being placed on it. by becoming more resilient to changes in stress. So if you're doing for an extended period of time something that is slightly lower, say for example, say your zone 2 is 180 watts and you're doing 150 watts, you're pretty much all the way there. And most likely one of the main benefits of zone 2 training is to accumulate more volume. So most likely with that 150 compared to that 180, you're probably accumulating less fatigue and are able to actually do more volume. So it's that consistency, specificity, and progression again, right?
Right.
If 150 is going to allow you to stay consistent and progress, then yeah, that is the optimal, one for you to do, not the 180. And again, I fall into this trap all the time. I had a really good test, 4 or 5 weeks ago where it said, oh, your zone 2 is at 180 watts. So I have not done, other than like on recovery rides and then 30 minutes today, I haven't done anything under 180,
Right.
which
right.
I'm over here. I'm talking about how you need to go easier and stuff like that. But then I'm just ignoring it because I'm like, oh, well, I need to push that threshold up a little bit. But the point is that I'm able to actually recover from all of this, still hit my hard days hard. And I have a limited amount of time. So, there's a number of different factors that go into it, but yeah, I would say it's about the same.
Yeah, and I think now this is going to turn into the Zone 2 podcast, but I think that's a valid point, and that's something, like I said when I was talking to this athlete, is like, I think a lot of times as athletes we get tunnel vision, and we think each day happens in a vacuum, and it's like it's not. Like we need to consider what happened the last 3 days and what's going to happen the next 3 days, and so like. Today's setting up the next 3 days. And if I go too hard today on my zone 2 day or my endurance day, then when it's my BO2 day 3 days from now, and if I can't hit the numbers, then I'm not getting the stimulus that we want for adaptation. And even though it feels just as hard, we're not getting where we need to be. And so it just, I don't know. I call it the boner zone, where it's like, if it feels hard, it feels good. But it's like, it's not really achieving a whole lot.
I love that. That is so funny. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Don't be in the boner zone, guys. That's oh my gosh. Yeah. I think that's really the gauge, right? Is if you have targets for, say, VO2 max or high intensity work that you're doing and you're not able to hit those targets, there's a high likelihood that you're accumulating too much fatigue or not recovering enough from the work that you're doing leading up to that. So for me personally, that's exactly how I gauge it, is I say, okay, well, and what's really crazy, and I know you're a cycling coach, but I have found that since I have transitioned to cycling more seriously, I'm able to recover so much better compared to running. And again, that allows me to kind of push into that like low zone 2 gray zone, training, while still being able to recover and then hit really, really good VO2 max workouts, for at least for me.
Right.
So it's one of those things, like, use that as a gauge. Are you able, like, with the training that you're currently doing, when you ask yourself to go and hit high intensity work, are you able to actually hit that? Or are you, tapping out, a couple intervals early, like a set early, other things like that? Because if that's the case, then you definitely have to reduce the wattage that you're going at, during your zone 2.
And so this is a good kind of segue into our next zone. Mm-hmm. So we left zone 1, we went through this transition area, and now we've entered zone 2. And so what's starting to happen?
Yeah.
What changes are taking place once we're creeping into, what is this, the heavy domain now? Is that the
zone 2? It's what is it? Moderate, heavy, and severe. That's another thing, is there's so much vernacular. So I apologize to people, like whoever the researchers were that came up with everything, they just make it more and more confusing. It's like, totally. When I read legal documents and I don't understand a word, I get mad because I'm like, oh, these guys are purposely pulling the wool over my eyes. And I again, gives me a job, right? Because I can actually then, try to translate it to people. Yeah. But okay, so if we think of zone 1 as, kind of like that exercise intensity that you could probably do for forever, like if you're doing ultra marathons, really long bike races, like you were talking about, You should be able to do that for really, really extended periods of time as long as you're eating adequately. When you pass that transition area into the heavy domain, or the, I guess it's like more, it's like threshold, right? It's gray zone, it's threshold, it's something along those lines. And you're giving me a perplexed look, and here's my definition.
But this would be zone 3, right? Like this would be 10, in a 5 or a 7 zone model. Now we're talking about like,
oh, okay, yeah, so we have to, I'm talking a 3 zone model, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
so zone 1 is, okay, this is why it's so confusing. So let's do a 5 zone model, just because, okay, that's a little bit, I think, people use it a little bit more. So
Yeah.
within 5 zones, right, your zone 2 training is that first transition point. And then within, so zone 3 then is like, I don't even know what people call it, but it's like, could be called your gray zone, your sweet spot zone, borderline, threshold, sort of area. And what's happening is your body is starting to recruit more type 2 fibers. Type 2 fibers are those fibers that actually start to use more carbohydrates. And this is where the carbohydrates are like that kind of high octane fuel. So your body is transitioning towards more carbohydrates. And along with that, as you get closer and closer to that second transition point, your body is breaking down more and more carbohydrates. When you break down carbohydrates, they come in the form of this molecule called pyruvate. Pyruvate can either be taken up into your mitochondria, where they can be broken down and then paired with the creation of water with oxygen. So that's where we use oxygen, is within the mitochondria. And if we don't have enough mitochondria to take up the pyruvate that's being created, then what we see is that pyruvate start to get formed into lactate.
Right.
That lactate has to go somewhere. It's not getting uptaken by the mitochondria within that muscle cell. So it gets shipped out of that muscle cell and, could potentially make it to another muscle cell. Or if we're above or, through that second transition zone, then we start to see lactate accumulate in the blood. And this is where your second threshold, or your FTP, critical power, ventilatory threshold to Neer's breakpoint to your lactate at 4 millimole, your second rise in lactate, or onset of blood lactate accumulation, whatever you want to call it, is actually occurring. So it's that transition point between what is metabolically sustainable, so what your mitochondria can maximally uptake, and to kind of a runaway freight train of lactate being accumulated in the blood. The accumulation of lactate in the blood is just a surrogate marker of the body being like, oh shit, I'm unraveling. But you'll see your heart rate is starting to increase. Your oxygen uptake is actually starting to continually increase past that second threshold. You'll have issues reestablishing oxygen homeostasis within the muscle. So if you're looking at Neers, your SMO2 will actually continue to drop if you're past that second threshold. So it's the point of, no longer being able to have your body reestablish homeostasis or a steady state.
And tell me if this is like oversimplifying it, but like, so below the first threshold, or below the first transition area, things are stable. So if we were to measure lactate, it would stay pretty much the same. If you're looking at muscle oxygen, it would be high at once you're warmed up, and it would stay pretty much the same.
Yeah, it would go up once you're or as you warm up, and then it would stay very high. Yeah.
Then we transition. We pass that first area. And so if we were looking at lactate, we would see it rise, but it would still stabilize at some point. Like we'd see it like rise above baseline, but it would stabilize. If we were looking at muscle oxygen, it would start to decrease, but it would also stabilize at some point, telling us that something's happening, something's being produced, but we're able to handle it. Like we're maintaining homeostasis. And then once we cross this second threshold, shit goes haywire. We just can't like exchange it as quickly as it's being produced, and eventually it's going to build up and we're going to blow up.
Yep, exactly. So that was actually, that's a perfect summary where, kind of like that. So zone 1 and zone 2 in a 5 zone model are kind of steady. Like your body is able to stay steady. Then you reach a stabilization phase where you can reestablish a steady, higher than baseline. So you can restabilize, whether that's lactate, whether that's muscle oxygen consumption, but you find that you can reach a steady state. Then once you transition, past that second threshold, then that's the non-steady area. And that's where, like stuff like, metabolites are starting to accumulate. Your body is signaling we need to work harder and harder and harder. That's why your heart rate continues to go up. You need to try to get as much oxygen still to your, working muscle. And it's just everything is kind of unraveling. So if you keep trying to increase that power, eventually you're going to reach fatigue. That's exactly like the whole idea of a maximal oxygen test, right? Is we start really low and we increase, a certain amount of power every few minutes. And then eventually, it's like running up a hill that gets steeper and steeper and steeper.
Yeah.
Eventually, you're not going to be able to go up that hill anymore, just because your body is incapable of actually creating enough force to, say, keep those pedals moving or keep you running up that hill.
And so would this be reflected in heart rate too? So if you're below the first threshold, heart rate's steady, you cross over the first one and it kind of like rises, but then plateaus, and then you cross over the second, and it just keeps going until you hit VO2 max, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it yes and no, because heart rate is actually really, really sensitive to everything else that's happening in the body too. So if your body is actually continuing to warm up, say, so for that first, that first zone that we're talking about, I would say yes, most likely your heart rate should be able to stay steady. But that second, you still see a little bit. The researchers call it cardiac drift.
Right.
So there's some level of cardiac drift that is occurring, and that could be due to depletion of muscle glycogen, increases in core body temperature. That's going to push more blood to the skin and other things like that. And then so there might be some cardiac drift, but then once you hit that second threshold, then it's like, yep, it's gonna eventually keep increasing. I don't know how long it's going to take, because that's a function of how hard you're working, the temperature, how quickly you're depleting glycogen, other things like that. But eventually that's going to trend towards your maximal heart rate. And at the same time, your VO2 max is going to continue to go up, other things like that.
Okay. So I guess one thing I want to mention, just because we were talking about endurance work or zone 2 work, and like one of the big things is just like being able to recover quickly enough that you can maintain a high volume. And I think the reason I brought up like zone 2 in the 3-zone model, or zone 3 or sweet spot in a 5-zone model, is that something I've seen, is that a lot of athletes, maybe they don't have a lot of time, and so everybody kind of shifts to this like sweet spot methodology. But what I've seen is it just creates a lot of fatigue. And so I think it might be great for newer athletes, where really any stimulus is going to be enough to move the needle, but like eventually it just like creates a lot of fatigue, so that you can't like do the hard work that you need to. And that's just like when I've tried it myself, and when I've taken on athletes who've like followed something like that, that's what I see. And so like I start working with them, and at first they're like, the work's not hard enough, right? But then eventually, like after a month or two, they're like, wow, I feel way better. I have a lot more energy. And now all of a sudden they're like hitting new peak powers, because they can when it's time to.
Right.
So just to hammer that at home one more time, like the biggest thing is consistency and being able to go hard when it matters.
Yeah. And that's not to say that there's not a time and a place for that, gray zone, that sweet spot training, whatever you want to call it. Because, for example, so this is one of the reasons why I kind of just call it like threshold, like that zone 2 threshold, because if you're thinking about, second threshold as like your critical power, your functional threshold power, or something like that, what is going to happen if you do an FTP test that is 2 hours long? So for example, you want to, if your goal is to do a 2-hour race, then you better know pretty damn well what your 2-hour functional threshold power is, right? Like that's what's going to be your quote unquote second threshold, in my opinion. If you're race is an hour, then you're going to want to know what your 1 hour FTP is. If your race is 30 minutes, you're going to want to know what your 30-minute FTP is. If your race is 6 hours, you're going to want to know what your 6 hour FTP is. So what I think, that second threshold should shift based off of whatever it is you're trying to train for, right? Because we're trying to figure out what the, sustainable to non-sustainable power is. Like, that's what second threshold is really trying to give us. But that's going to shift based on how long your race actually is.
Right.
Does that kind of make sense?
It in my understanding of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like part of what's happening once we're getting, I mean, it's athlete dependent for sure, but it's like, even if you're sitting, let's say at the top of zone 2, like going back to our zone 2 of 180 watts. Well, if you're holding that for like 4 or 5 hours, eventually those type 1 fibers start to fatigue and you start to recruit more type 2 fibers. And so you're going to start to burn more glycogen, burn more carbohydrate, produce more lactate. And so the fatigue's still going to happen, even though it's not an hour, it's going to mimic a lot of what's happening when you cross that threshold. Right.
Right. Yeah. And so I guess my point though is that I think, cause if we start to talk about, people do 20-minute FTP, right, as their like threshold power, but I would really argue that second threshold is really going to be dependent on whatever race you're doing, because your ability to maintain 20 minutes versus an hour versus 3 hours versus 6 hours, like at the end of the day, performance is what we're ultimately trying to get to.
Right.
And most likely, right, you're not going to be, well, I don't know. It's a little bit of a tangent, but I think though, like, I think people, have this myopic view that like, the FTP or critical power or whatever it is this like, this magical, threshold again. And I don't really think it is. I think what we need to do is we need to take a step back and we need to say, okay, well, if I'm training for something and, I need to get better at maintaining my power output for 3 hours because it's a 3-hour ride, then I need to do stuff that's going to push that ability to maintain that 3 hours, at higher wattage, if that makes any sense. I don't know if I'm making sense here, but
it does. And I think this kind of goes back to something you and I had talked about prior to the podcast. And it's like, so getting back to these thresholds or these transition areas, it's like, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but really it's like we have 3 of them. So you've got VO2 max, which is kind of set 4.
Yep.
Let's say 4. You've also got peak power, but let's say VO2 max, which is kind of setting the ceiling on your aerobic potential.
Correct.
Then you have FTP or critical power or whatever. That's kind of like a percentage that you can hold of that VO2 max. Right. And that's when we're like kind of maintaining homeostasis, like the highest sustainable power output without blowing up.
Right.
Then below that, we've got that first transition area, which is kind of our aerobic threshold. Right. And so it's like, when we're talking about this, it's like really thinking about where are you going to be operating, like depending on the duration of your race, where in those 3 areas are you going to be operating, and how do you maximize your sustainable output in that area?
Yep. Right. And it changes, right? Because if you're closer, like, so for example, if you said people rate, like they'll do the Leadville and it's like a 12-hour race, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So if 12 hours has to be your sustainable pace, you're going to be pretty close, to that first, your aerobic threshold, if we want to call it that. And the things that influence fatigue are going to be a lot different than if we're racing, say, for a 15-minute, like a 5K race or something like that. Right. Like if we're running a 5K race. So this is where the specificity of training comes in, right? And maybe not in the off season like we're at now, but as you get closer to that race, you better be doing a lot more race specific, training, in my opinion.
No. And the reason my eyes got big is like, my kind of light bulb goes off, and you had mentioned this myopic view. And I think this is a thing that I've seen happen over the years of coaching, it's like we hear that FTP is the most important thing. So what does everybody do? Just hammer threshold intervals all day, every day, trying to make FTP go up, right?
Yep.
Or now there's this polarized model. And so what does everybody do? Oh, it has to be this. And it's like,
Yeah.
we have this huge range of human performance curve. And it's like really over the course of the year, we should be working on every part of that curve at some point, regardless if you're doing a 24-hour race or a 10-minute race. Like you should be working on some of it at some point during the year, right? But I think as athletes, and especially when a new article comes out or something, we like read it. It's like, oh, this is a magic workout. This is all I'm doing for the next 6 months, you know?
Yeah, that's, I mean, you don't even know how many questions I get about the Norwegian method and double lactate, you know, the threshold days. It's everyone's like, so, but that's a perfect case in point, right? Is like the Norwegian method is effective for those guys in Norway because of where they're at in their training. They need to accumulate a lot of work at 1500 to 5K pace. In order to actually do that, what they have found is that by monitoring their lactate levels and not going above a certain point, they're able to accumulate more speed, more training time at, you know, their 1500 pace or their 5K pace.
Yeah.
That's all it is. So talk about specificity of training. They're maximizing their specificity of training, and that's why it's helping them, you know, do so well. I can also tell you that that's not the only thing that they're doing. Like they're not just doing double lactate threshold days every single day because it's a magic workout. No, it's one workout in a big puzzle that is actually working towards, you know, making, you know, Jakob Ingebrigtsen as good as he is.
Yeah.
Or the you know, Norwegian triathletes, right? So I've talked about this on my podcast as well, as like, you know, you have to be very wary when you see just like, oh, this is the workout that's going to change everything. Because again, you have to say, okay, well, how is that workout going to fit into my consistency, specificity, and progression? If you're not ready, if it's a huge jump, right, you know, to do like, oh, well, I've never done a VO2 max workout in my life, then you probably shouldn't be doing like the same VO2 max workout as me.
Right.
Like, cause I've been consistently doing VO2 max workouts now for the last, you know, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And I've done it, you know, for 15, you know, 20 years of my life at this point. So it's, this is something that, Aaron Geiser says quite a bit. He said it on the podcast, is that it's context, then content. So, and what I mean by that is you have to know the context in which the athlete is coming to you, or you as the athlete are coming to a coach. What's your physiology? What's your training age? What's your ability to recover from stress? How stressful is your life? Do you have kids? Do you have dogs that you have to take care of? Do you have a family member that is dependent on you? Other things like that. And then from there, you can start to build out and make a little bit more pointed decisions in, oh, does it make sense for me to now jump into these double lactate threshold days, or, you know, do a polarized training model, or do a pyramidal training model? Because, you know, like it's a lot more nuanced than just, oh, if I do polarized training, I'm going to maximize my potential. No, I talked to the researcher who primarily does a lot of this research, and he told me that the first paper that came out that really pushed, you know, polarized training, it was a 4-week study that looked at developmental Norwegian cross-country skiers, and saw that most of them did a polarized training model for those 4 weeks. So that's the first paper, right? So talk about context. It's like that's 4 weeks of somebody's training. That's not a whole year.
Right.
And then he actually followed it up, and he did a really cool paper where he looked at training distribution over the course of an entire year. And what he found is that exactly what we're talking about. You go from your general phase in the off season where, you know, for example, if I was training for a 3-hour race, my general training phase is probably going to look like something where I'm doing a lot of volume. You're like, you know, really low intensity, like zone 2 or lower, and then VO2 max work, because that VO2 max work isn't going to really matter a whole lot in terms of specificity when I get to my actual race. So then what you do is you kind of funnel it down. You
Right.
bring up that intensity of your easier days, and you bring down that intensity of your harder days until you kind of reach, a sideways triangle where the point is, that intersection of I'm going to race 3 hours and I'm going to crush it.
Yeah.
So,
And I'll just a real quick note on that. And I like, because I do bag on sweet spot a lot or whatever. And it's like, I think that's where it comes into play, is that for a lot of people, I coach a lot of gravel cyclists and mountain bikers, but a lot of times that is their race pace. And so as we get closer to their event, then it does make sense to be doing a lot of that work because it's very specific to that. But it's not the only tool in our toolbox.
right, exactly.
So going back, and this was kind of where I was talking about those thresholds and our 3 different levels. This is something that I'm curious about, and you and I have talked about this before too, is that if I were to, me personally, if I were to do a 20-minute test, it would probably put my FTP. So again, 20 minutes doing it, like taking 95% of that, it'd probably put my FTP at like 300 watts.
Okay.
Anecdotally and like subjectively, when I'm out riding, I'm like, there's no way, it doesn't feel right. And so last year I got a lactate meter and did some lactate test. And I found that like it's probably more like 275, which is what I also felt. And so my kind of like feeling on this when we talk about the Norwegian method and stuff like that is like, I think like being more familiar with lactate and how it behaves now and stuff like that. I think a lot of people who set their FTP off of a 20-minute test, it's probably setting it too high. And I think that's why sweet spot has been so attractive to so many people. It's probably closer to what threshold actually is when they're doing all that work. And it's like this sustainable, comfortably hard pace that you could hold for a long time versus if I tried to do like threshold work at 300 watt, like it's excruciating. Like I can't do a lot of it, Right. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I did a lot of like critical power testing during my master's degree. And are you familiar with that?
I know there's a lot of different methods.
Yeah. So essentially what it requires you to do is it requires you to do like 3 to 5 all out time trials to exhaustion. And then you measure how much power you can maintain, for a certain amount of time, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes. Then you draw a curve, and it's a mathematical equation that basically says, okay, based on this curve, where does it taper out? That's where your critical power is, your FTP, whatever you want to call it. So we were doing all these tests, and I was just interested in it because I was like, oh, this seems like a sweet way of being able to determine, sustainable and unsustainable. And, then by definition, right, you were reading in the research and other people are like, oh, well, FTP should be around an hour. So you should be able to maintain this for 30 to 60 minutes. So then what we would do is we would take people, we would do these critical power tests, and then we'd take them, we'd put them on a bike, and we'd say, okay, now you got to maintain this power for as long as possible. And we were finding that people are only able to maintain it for like 14 to 25 minutes, depending on like how well trained they were and other things like that. So yes, I think to answer your question, I do think that a lot of the times we're overestimating, where that actual balance point is. And that's where, things like maximal lactate steady state have kind of come into the fold, is because that's been shown to be even lower, than critical power, and seems to be a good indicator of, your body's ability to reestablish some level of steady state, and then, continue to exercise, from there. So and we also have to remember, and I can't remember exactly where like the definition of like, oh, do a 20-minute FTP and then take 95%. It was Andy Coggan, right?
Andy Coggan and Hunter Allen. And I think Hunter Allen's the one that came up with that. And where a lot of people, not to like hijack this, but I think a lot of people get it wrong because originally you did a 5-minute all out effort first and then did your 20-minute effort. Oh. And so people omit that first 5 minutes. And so I think that's part of it, is you don't have that extra fatigue that you would have had you done essentially a VO2 max effort right before it. you know?
That's super interesting. I didn't know that that was like the actual protocol to start with. Because what I was going to say is like, maybe they did it on professional athletes or did it something like that, where these athletes like 95% decrement, across 20 to 60 minutes may not be that much, like may not be that far fetched,
Yeah.
for a professional athlete, but for us mere mortals, like maybe it's 90%, right? But we don't know. That's the problem.
Right.
And that's exactly, I think, what we can talk about is like with a 20-minute FTP, what you're finding out is you're finding out what your sustainable pace for 20 minutes is, right? That's
exactly
and that's what I'm trying to remind everybody of is like, what does a certain measurement tell us? Like lactate is only telling us how much lactate is within your blood at that given moment. It's not telling us how much carbohydrates being oxidized or broken down in your muscle. It's not telling us how much is being taken up. It's just telling us what the answer is, how much lactate is making it into the blood. Same thing with skeletal muscle oxygenation. How it's the percentage, if we're looking at SMO2, it's a percentage of oxygen that is bound to your red blood cells or not. That's all it's telling us. But of course, then if we start to add, more data points, then we can start to get a better idea of, oh, well, is the slope going down? Is the slope going up? Is it staying steady? Other things like that. So it's the same with heart rate, right? Heart rate is just telling us how hard our heart is beating. It's not telling us what our cardiac output is. It's not telling us what our stroke volume is. All of these things that potentially could be changing it. And I think what we lose track of is everybody wants, a single answer to something.
Yeah.
Comes down to FTP, right? Oh, if I just get my 20-minute FTP, I can multiply that by 95 or, by 95%. And then from there, I can determine what my zones are based on, I think you said 56 to 75% of FTP is supposed to be zone two.
Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, where does that come from?
I mean, just like, so that would be Coggin and Allen also.
Okay. So probably based on, their research and their experience and other things like that, they came up with, most likely it's between 56 and 74%, because some people are on that really high end, other people are on that really low end, but that's almost 20% difference.
Well, and so I want to bring this up. Like, this is something I say to athletes all the time, like, especially when I start coaching them, is like, especially in exercise science, it's like, I always tell them, like, I operate on a bell curve, right? Like, based on things, it's like, I always start with the bell curve, and this is going to work for most people, but there's also outliers. There's 30% below there and 30% above there. And so like with that, right, it's like, those zones are based on a bell curve that the majority of people fit into this, but there's always going to be outliers on the high and low end there.
Yep. Yeah. And that's, with a few minutes that I actually got to go, at noon, but with a few minutes, I'll use this kind of as a little bit of a plug, if you don't mind, for physiological assessments and why you as an athlete should probably be doing that. Because, if we're operating on a bell curve for, like max heart rate or heart rate zones, FTP zones, other things like that, why not just test it? Yeah. Like, if you could do a step test that is, about the same as any workout that you would do, and then you determine what your zones are. Again, they can shift based on fatigue, based on hydration status, other things like that. But by getting an individual zoning plan, you're going to get estimates that are much, much closer to what you as an athlete are actually capable of versus, oh, well, these researchers observed in, 15 college age trained men. Trained mice, right? That threshold was occurring between 56% and 40 or 74%, or, whatever, if the things are backwards, of, second threshold. Yeah. So why not, why not do that? And I understand the why not is, well, it's freaking expensive. Like that's the big thing, right? Is people go in and they're like, if you can even get a spot at a local university, it's, anywhere between $350 and $500. It could even be more. Like I've seen some testing protocols that are like $715. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like no wonder people don't want to do this sort of stuff. Yeah. So this kind of brings it back. And, I work for Moxie Monitor, which is near infrared spectroscopy company. And we've teamed up with Full Gas, which Dave does a little bit of consulting work for, and a company called Trainalyze that actually has made physiological models that allow us to take your Moxie response, your heart rate, and your power variables, put those into our model, and then give you estimates of things like VO2 max, maximal lactate steady state, VLA max if you're a sprinter and you're really interested in that. And then all your zones as well as carbohydrate oxidation. So it's one of those things where it gives us the opportunity to actually estimate and get a better get that compass, from, kind of being like, 90, maybe 90 degrees difference to maybe dialing it a little bit, maybe 15 degrees difference.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in something like that, feel free to reach out to me. I'm at Critical02 on Instagram. And Dave might have shared my post the other day about continuous lactate monitors, but that's something you guys should check out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll link to that in the show notes as well. The video. And so, yeah, real quick, you just said where we can find you on Instagram. Are you on Twitter or X that it's called nowadays, or where else can we find you?
Yeah, it's generally Instagram is the best place to reach me. That's where I do most of my, sharing of research and other, fun, entertaining physiology sort of stuff. But I do have a podcast. It's called Critical Oxygen Podcast. It's on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. So you can find me on YouTube as well, or on, whatever podcast platform that you're interested in.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time. I knew that we wouldn't get to all the bullet points, so maybe I'll have you come back another time, but I certainly appreciate it. And I think it was fantastic. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Dave. I really appreciate it.
Take care.